Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to our July 14th, 2021, which happens to be Bastille Day, TSCA 3030. The title of today's talk is More and More Reporting on the Biden Administration's Implementation of TSCA. That's quite a prescient title because, as it turns out, EPA just issued a proposed rule that will call for more and more TSCA data reporting in support of prioritization, risk evaluation, and risk management. In fact, they're scheduling a public meeting, virtual public meeting on July 27 between 1 and 3 p.m. And what they're thinking about is expanding CDR reporting substantially. They may require 8A pair rules, including reporting by processors. They're considering more 8D rules, and they may well call in 8 TSCA 8C complaints. Do you remember TSCA 8C? Well, 8C is complaints, by customers or people living in near a facility, and you have to keep records of those complaints. And so you should probably check your files to make sure you actually have some 8C complaints in files. Next slide, please. I'm Herbert Stryker. I give a lot of these. Next slide. I'm joined by my partner, James Votar, who also gives a substantial number of these. Next slide. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about two reporting obligations. One is now a final rule for reporting under Section 8D, reporting of unpublished health and safety studies. I will tell you, the last time EPA has had an 8D rule was in, I think, 2006. Right. And quite frankly, this is one of the few occasions I have to check the regs to refresh myself about what this is all about, because usually I don't have to check anything about TSCA. But here, when it came to 8D, it's been so many years, 20 years since EPA's had one of these rules, that I had to check the regulations to refresh myself. James Votar is going to talk about a proposed rule, Section 8A rule for PFAS chemicals. Next slide, please. So what's going on with this 8D rule? Well, first of all, it's final. There was no proposed rule. Why would there's no proposed rule? Well, because the statute provides for automatic reporting if the Interagency Testing Committee, or ITC, lists a chemical on the list for reporting. So basically, there you go. So now we have a final rule issued June 24th, June 29th. It covers 50 chemicals. 20 of these are the high priority substances for risk evaluation, which EPA is actively doing risk evaluations on, and probably of most interest to this group. 30 substances are organohalogen flame retardants that are of interest to the Consumer Product Safety Commission. The rule is effective July 29th, and it provides for a 60-day reporting period, terminating on September 27, 2021. There was an opportunity to request that a chemical be withdrawn from the final rule for good cause, but that must have been received by EPA yesterday. And I don't know if anyone petitioned to remove any of these chemicals. I know there were some arguments before the ITC that there's enough data on these chemicals, but that was rejected by the ITC. And quite frankly, the Biden administration, EPA, is not going to grant any of these withdrawal requests. So if you feel badly because it's too late to submit one, don't feel bad. Next slide, please. So what's a health and safety study? Health and safety study is basically anything you can think of that involves health or safety. It includes studies in the traditional sense. It includes epidemiological studies. It includes monitoring studies, modeling studies of certain kind and quality. So basically, it's extremely broad. The good news is that trade associations can submit these studies for their individual members. And there are certain health and safety studies that are exempt, specifically ones that are published in the scientific literature, studies that were previously submitted to EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, but that's limited to Section 8D submissions, studies submitted during a Section 4 proceeding, studies submitted with PMNs or SNUNs, and studies submitted for your information, formal for your information submissions, which people sometimes, well, they used to do rather than submit ADs until EPA started finding people doing that. And also studies that have been initiated pursuant to a test rule for which the person has submitted a letter of intent or exempt from listing. So, by the way, there's an obligation to submit studies if you have them in your possession, but also to list studies if you don't have them in your possession, but you're aware of them, and you can have the full title in terms of the title of the study and and who likely is to have a copy of the study in their possession. Next slide, please. There are also some important exemptions. Studies that were submitted to a federal agency with no claim of confidentiality. You don't have to submit those studies, but you do have to list them. Again, remember, there's a study submission requirement and a listing requirement. PhysChem and QTOX studies on mixtures are exempt. Very, very importantly, if you only manufacture, import, or process the substances in purity, you don't have to submit studies on that basis. There are some limitations on monitoring data, and the monitoring data must be aggregated. Raw data is not sufficient. It has to be in the report, and it has to be analyzed in some way. So the monitoring data must be analyzed to determine exposure and concentration of the substance. It must be summarized, tabulated, or aggregated in some way. Mere raw monitoring data per se is not reportable. The data needs to have been analyzed and discussed. There's a very important Q&A on monitoring and modeling data. That's subject to, and not subject to reporting. I give you the link there. As always, we will include a copy of these slides and a recording of the presentation on our website under TSCAS /30/30. Modeling, there's only certain types of modeling studies need to be submitted. The studies must estimate actual or reasonably likely levels of existing chemical releases. Worst case models based on worst case assumptions need not be submitted. So, for example, sometimes companies do vulnerability analyses and support emergency planning. Those don't have to be submitted because they're not based on actual likely exposure scenarios. Next slide. So who needs to report? Well, basically, if you had any dealings, if you manufactured or imported these chemicals in the last 10 years, or you propose to do so, you're subject to reporting requirement. It only captures companies within NICS code 325, but that's very broad, that's manufacturing, and NAICS code 324110, which is for petroleum refineries. But I would suspect that everybody on this call would be covered under code 325. So again, if you've manufactured or imported any of these listed substances within the last 10 years, you're subject to reporting. You're even subject to reporting even if you stopped doing it, but as long as you've done it the last 10 years. Importantly, your obligation to search files is limited. It's limited to records in the location where the required information is typically kept, and to records kept by the person or person's individual employees who are responsible for keeping such records or advising the person on health and environmental effects of chemicals. So basically, it's environmental health and safety group where they keep these kinds of records. This creates some difficulty nowadays because, as I said, this is a very old rule, and it really hasn't been in effect for the last 25 years. And so now we have electronic record keeping, which in a lot of ways changes the ball game. And so it raises a lot of interesting questions as to how the electronic files have to be indexed in order for you to, in order for you to be able to search it properly. The rule does not contemplate a study or a file-by-file search. It has to be indexed in some way, usually by CAS number or some other identifier, so that one could reasonably be expected to find that study in the electronic file. So that raises a whole bunch of interesting questions now that everything's electronic as to what an adequate file search means. And the regulation, when it was written, clearly contemplated hard copy files. But as I said, the 8D has not been used for the last 25 years, and now everything's electronic. The good news is you don't have to search for information that was developed before January 1, 1977. I don't know if that's good news or not, but that's the rule. Next slide, please. So what needs to be reported? Okay, so if you have a copy of a health and safety study, that's not exempt. So basically unpublished health and safety studies. If they're in your possession, you have to submit a copy. If they're not in your possession, but if they're known to you, you have to submit a list. And the list has to be, actual citations. You have to have the name of the report and the, where it's who's likely to have it, the company is likely to have it in their possession. So that might be some limitation on the listing obligation. You're not required to search your company's foreign file system. However, if you know that a foreign subsidiary has has a report in their possession, then you do need to list it. So you also have to list health and safety studies that are ongoing and that are being conducted by or for you. You have to list health and safety studies that you plan to start and that are being conducted by or for you. And then ultimately, you have to then, after the reporting period, turn in copies of those studies that you listed. Next slide, please. Okay, but before I get to that, I did want to, see I'm missing a slide, but before I get to that, I did want to talk a little bit about the problem that this whole AT thing presents for companies that have REACH studies in their files. So, if you're a U.S. company and if you're, let's say, multinational, and your foreign subsidiaries or your own representatives have, commissioned or developed health and safety studies to comply with REACH, or you're a part of a consortium where they have developed health and safety studies for REACH registration, and you have in your U.S. files, either hard copy or electronically, a copy of those studies, you have to turn them in. Now, that could create huge and enormous problems. I mean, the first problem is you may be under contractual obligations with the data owners or with the consortia not to turn them over. Or there may be limitations on your ability to turn them over, even if demanded by a governmental authority. So lots of consortium agreements say you'll only turn over summaries. Others say you would have to notify the consortium, the data owners, and get permission to turn them over. So all kinds of variances of how you may be restricted by contract from actually complying with this rule. The other serious and significant problem is if you turn over that unpublished health and safety study, the REACH study, the EPA, and someone files a Freedom of Information Act request, EPA will release it and they'll put it in their docket. And then someone can then conceptually turn around and take that and submit it to the European Chemical Agency or Korea REACH or Turkey REACH or whatever other REACHs are out there, UK REACH, and not pay compensation to you and the data owners. So this, seriously threatens to undermine intellectual property rights. Now, we do think there may be some solutions here, but they would require some discussions with EPA. We're trying to put together a group that would sit down with EPA to try to hammer out these practical problems. And one thing would be to ask for an extension of time to submit the AD reports limited to the TSCA. It's limited to the REACH studies, and that would have to be submitted by September 7th, which is the deadline for asking for an extension of time. So if companies on the line are interested in this problem, we've had a series of calls with some companies, but if you're interested in this problem, send me an email at striker@khlaw.com. Let me know you're interested, and we could talk about it. But certainly if you're subject to reporting for this first 20, you need to think about these issues, but be mindful of the fact that this is only the tip of the iceberg. EPA is clearly going to issue 80 rules for anything else it's looking at on the TSCA evaluation. So you may even see 80 rules for things that are being considered to be prioritized, 80 rules for things that are in the prioritization process, 80 rules for chemicals that are undergoing risk evaluation, 80 rules for chemicals that are undergoing risk management. So you can expect a lot of 80 rules, and you can expect, even if you're not subject to this problem of REACH studies for the first 20, you can certainly expect that's going to hit you at some point. So we're trying to put together kind of a group to have a discussion with EPA, to try to negotiate a way of at least maintaining intellectual property rights for these studies to the extent the law will allow. I turn this now over to James, who's going to talk about PFAS reporting. That's a proposed rule, so there's still something you can do about it. As I told you, this AD rule is a final rule, and you don't have much time. And by the way, the penalties for failing to comply with AD are per day violations, which would be $40,000 per day, and the extent could be 1 to 5 years, depending on how serious EPA considers the study that was not submitted to their mission, which I suspect, since they're doing risk evaluation in these top 20, they're probably likely to take the position that any of these studies should be subject to a 5-year cap on per day penalties. So the costs of not complying with AD are enormous. And, if EPA doesn't get much studies on this time around, they have no choice but to demonstrate that they're serious and take aggressive enforcement action to ensure that they'll get studies the next time they send out an AD rule, which I suspect is going to be quite frequent now. James, I'll turn this over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Herb. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk now about, as Herb said, a proposed rule. This comes out of an amendment to TSCA came in the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, from 2019. And it included a directive to EPA to issue a rule collecting information about PFAS from manufacturers. Next slide. The deadline for that rule for EPA is January 1st, 2023. There's no sort of deadline in the statute for reporting, like the TSCA, the inventory reset that we saw a couple of years ago. So EPA has a little flexibility on the timing for receiving information, but a fixed time to get this rule out. So EPA is promulgate or proposed this rule that's going to implement this piece of the statute, this new piece of Section 8A. And it generally requires, consistent with the requirement of the statute, that all manufacturers of PFAS substances report on a wide range of endpoints within the scope of Section 8. And you sort of a summary of those categories here on the slide, but it's chemical identity, the categories of use. You'll see that they use a sort of a format like CDR, sort of identifying categories of use. And the way you would identify those, but looking for estimates of the amounts manufactured by year going back to 2011. So it's going to be more than 10 years back by year for amounts used and categories of use. And then detailed descriptions of how they're used and byproducts and the nature of the byproducts and how they're disposed. And then detailed information about worker exposure and environmental release, not sort of just pulling a number out of your production records, and really looking for estimates. And then all existing environmental health and safety information, effects information. And Herb just listed all the different kinds of public or other information that EPA may already have about a chemical that you don't need to report again for the AD rule. Well, for here, not only do you have to report it, everybody has to report this sort of the same information, for example, for published studies, the way the rule is written. So it's, depending on how you count, it's 35 sort of individual data points, per chemical, per site, per year for 10 or more years going back. So it's a very broad scope once you're in. And the purpose of the collection, in EPA is clear about this, even though their motive here is principally to meet the statutory obligation to promulgate a rule. There's no specific kind of project to which this data is directed to help support. They say that they'll use this to support new chemical TSCA decision making, but also be useful to other parts of the agency. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, obviously the PFAS of some concern, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, RCRA, and then CERCLE as well. And there's talk now about making some PFAS, designating those as hazardous substances. You could see that having information like this, which will essentially sort of identify the agency whole supply chains, could be a litigation concern if used in a circle context. Next slide. So the rules is very broad, I said, for a couple of reasons. One is sort of just the scope of the information that's sought. Another aspect is the scope of the chemicals that are sort of captured in this. EPA has defined PFAS, the reportable PFAS, very broadly. So it's sort of any alkyl carbon product where the hydrogen atoms have been partially completely replaced by fluorine atoms. So this is thousands and thousands of chemicals potentially, and includes both sort of the long chain perfluoroalkyl substances that were subject of the amended SNR on PFAS from last year. So things in the carbon range of 7 to 20, but also the shorter chain materials, which are thought to be less persistent and weren't regulated in the SNR. And also the very long chain materials that otherwise were carved out of that SNR. So these are all fluoropolymers are probably captured by this rule. For reporting purposes. And again, EPA has not identified the reportable materials based on their risk. There's no judgment about risk here at all in this selection. It's just based on the way PFAS were described in the statute. Although you may have difficulty, persuading your customers that they about that. These are very useful chemistries. They provide wonderful properties to a wide variety of materials. So they're very widely used. And as we'll talk about there, because things like articles and the imports of articles are not exempt, it's going to affect, a great number of products in a lot of different industries, both sort of these finished products, but also sort of components of complex articles. Tubes and gaskets and piping and, just a lot of sort of basic materials that need to be sort of tough and chemical resistant. It's also going to pick up not only things that were sort of formulated with like a fluoropolymer, but also other kinds of articles that may have been fluorinated after manufacture to give them chemical resistance or other properties. So there's a wide range of potentially affected products. Next slide, please. As I said, so there are, Herb again talked about the number of exemptions and things that, that don't need to be, that aren't applicable. There are none of those exemptions here. So this means, there are lots of places where companies are often, technically could be deemed to be a manufacturer or an importer. It's subject to TSCA requirements, and EPA, routinely carves those out from notices or other kinds of reporting because they are sort of incidental or relate to essentially sort of waste. They're not the intended chemical product. None of those exemptions exist here. So companies who are importing these cover chemical as an impurity or as part of an article. If you use it as part of an R&D material, or you're working with it under an LVE, non-isolated intermediates, all of these things are going to be reportable. So even if you're consciously working with one material, you may need to do reports on several materials as well. But it's going to pick up, I think, a lot of companies that don't anticipate seeing themselves as a manufacturer only because they use the products and they're sort of incidental kinds of reactions usually are ignored by TSCA. There's no de minimis exemption for volume or concentration. And really importantly, there's no small business exemption. Section 8A1, which is a piece under which this is ultimately promulgated, it provides for a carve out for small businesses. And EPA has taken the position that does not apply in this case, and they have elected not in this proposal to provide any small business exemption. Next slide. The one, if there is a saving grace here, is that there is sort of a due diligence standard, and it's akin to the one that Herb described for the 8D, but companies are required to only provide information to the extent it's known or reasonably ascertainable. So this involves, though, really looking through all of the information that's available within your organization. And given the kind of the nature of the material that's involved here, that may be not only sort of chemical regulatory staff, but it's going to maybe your marketing people and your import, your supply chain folks, to identify the various pieces of information that that EPA is looking for. But the really significant piece is, and this is not unique to this rule, but is that there's an obligation to fill a data gap to at least make an inquiry with your upstream suppliers or downstream users, where that's sort of reasonable to do. And that can obviously create an enormous amount of time, both to identify those, to have those conversations. And I think that there are often some commercial issues associated with trying to get that kind of information. So this is really sort of expands the amount of work that may be involved in responding to this this information request. Next slide. Again, Section 8A typically requires EPA in doing one of these rules to take reasonable steps to eliminate unnecessary or duplicative requests, information submissions, and to steer and tailor the rule so that the information request is really directed to those with the most relevant information. And the agency, again, I think, has sort of taken the view that the way the statute is written, there's sort of limited need to do that. But there really is, I would say, sort of a very minimal effort to do any kind of tailoring to reduce the burden here. It's really sort of a shotgun approach. I think really some lost opportunities to eliminate some of the burden. But anyway, so suffice to say that they've done none, and I think there are opportunities to do more. Next slide, please. So that's sort of the quick overview. I think that there are sort of two opportunities, I think, for companies now to have input on this to try and create the ultimate shape. And the first is under the Paperwork Reduction Act. The OMB is reviewing EPA's information collection request submitted with this rule. The OMB is accepting comments on that piece until the end of July, and that is really the first opportunity, an important opportunity to have someone other than the agency evaluating whether the agency has sort of evaluated the burden of this data collection properly, both in terms of the number of companies that are affected and the time involved in responding to these, as well as whether this is the information collected is sort of necessary or whether there are other opportunities to make it less burdensome. So, for example, EPA estimates that only less than 250 companies will need to respond. The estimate will cost, I think it's $33,000 per each to do this response for purposes of their ICR. But I think just looking at the number of products involved just with fluoropolymers, anyway, it's going to affect a much greater universe of companies than EPA anticipates. So it's important, if you can, to weigh in early on the OMB information collection. So the comments on the rule itself to EPA are due currently at the end of August. I think all of those same sort of burden reduction opportunities ought to be raised with EPA. And I think there are opportunities to, EPA has to come up to some rule to meet the statutory requirement, but I think there are a lot of possibilities to sort of tailor this through tiering or doing things in sort of stages, eliminating duplication that would allow me to get to the same information with less duplication. Next slide.
Okay, so we have some questions here. I'll do the AD ones. I'll give James a chance to look at the PFAS ones. So we have quite a few questions, so we can respond in a couple of minutes. I want to ask whether studies that the European Chemical Agency disseminates on their website, whether they're considered published and therefore not subject to reporting under AD. Well, ECHA does not disseminate studies. They disseminate summaries. So those are not studies. So even if you considered what ECHA puts on their website to be published, which is questionable, they're not studies, they're just summaries. So if you have hard copies of these studies in your files in the US, either electronically or hard copy files, you got to submit them. So that's the bad news. Okay, so somebody asks if you do for 8D, if you have industrial hygiene monitoring data for one of the 20 chemicals, does that mean you need to submit an aggregate of that data? No, you have to already have had the aggregate produced at some point prior to the rule, prior to July 29th. So if you somehow have a report that aggregated and analyzed the industrial hygiene monitoring data, and then it actually discusses the exposure to workers, then you have to turn it in. But you don't have to prepare an aggregation for purposes of Section 18. If you have one already, by the time we're going into effect, July 29th, it has to be turned in. Another 8D. Can companies claim CBI for portions of studies submitted? It may be that companies wish to keep aspects of the study CBI so others do not use it to register similar chemicals elsewhere. Well, that's the heart of the matter. I mean, the heart of the matter is, Section 14 of TSCA says that health and safety studies cannot be claimed CBI. Now, conceptually, there's not everything that's in a study report is health and safety data. There are administrative details, and so the issue would be, and why we're trying to get a group together, is to sit down with EPA and hammer out precisely what it is that we can claim CBI, so that companies will not be able to successfully submit an Euclid robust study summary on this data to Europe or to Turkey or the UK, or submit a successful summary, to the Korean system, because there'd be certain critical administrative details that are missing. In the case of PB29, EPA, ultimately released most of the studies in their dockets that were FOIA'd. But I think that there could be a much more, careful look at what is a health and safety study, what could still legitimately be claimed as CBI, and EPA would agree not to release to the public because of the breach of intellectual property rights. But again, that's going to require hammering out with EPA. And as I said, time is short. Let's see. I think the other 8D one, and then I'll turn this over to James, which looks like it's mostly PFAS, a lot of PFAS stuff. So James, you want to handle some of the PFAS stuff, and then we'll call it.
Sure. So the first one is whether it's going to apply to materials that are non-isolated intermediates, and yes, those are not exempt under the current proposal. Export only chemicals, I think that's an interesting question whether it apply to those, given the way the 12B is written. I think there's certainly an argument that those are not, but I have to think about that just a little bit more.
I think that'd be outside of Section 8 totally.
Yeah. Right, and the other things, of course, are things like pesticides or food, drugs, cosmetics. Those uses are also outside. Those are the important limitations. Question was asked about the re-import of domestically produced, otherwise reportable material, and the importer of that product, would be responsible for reporting. It the applicability was asked, does it also apply to perfluorinated chemicals? And the answer is yes. If they otherwise sort of meet that the description of the chemical formulation.
I think we have to go because we got Reach 3030 in 1 minute.
Okay.
So by the way, Reach 3030 this month is on registration of polymers, what the Europeans up to in terms of latest developments, what they're up to in terms of registration of polymers. And so I know a lot of companies on the line, you don't always stay for the Reach 3030, but this one you might want to, because if you ship polymers into Europe, this is going to impact you severely. And so that's that. And we're gonna leave now. And if you want to stay on the line for Reach 3030, although I think there's a new phone number, isn't there? I'll leave that. I'm gonna leave and then rejoin for the Reach 3030 because I think there's a new registration link. Take care, bye bye.